Toy Beovin Kol Yetzul Ki Ato Yetzal Toy Beida Kol Ki Ato Beotoy Beovin Kol Yetzul Ki Ato Yetzal Toy Beoimam Kol Hashem Shama Beotoy Hashem Elikei Yisrael Melech Beoimam Kol Hashem Shama Beotoy Hashem
Oh man, I love that song. That is Vayeda by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Efrat, Israel. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? We've got a spectacular page. It's going to be another one of those pages within Tractate Eruvin with beautiful digressions. You're in for a treat. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this lovely Sunday evening? Let me open that up. Okay. And we've got James Roth in the house from Indianapolis. Yehudit Sobel says shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Stephen Giger says shalom from New Hampshire at Berg. From Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. Melissa Eitel Jurin from Great Neck, New York. Brinna Bloomfield, Erev Tov from Sharon, Massachusetts. Randy Lieberman Herman says shalom from Florida. Kelsa Canedo from Pasadena, Texas. Karan Kumal Shetri, I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, says good morning from Nepal. Wow, welcome Karan. Pauline Michael, shalom from Arkansas. Martha Radsmirshka says hi from Canada. Amy Lee is with us from Knoxville, Tennessee. Nancy Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Alan Hales from Glasgow, Scotland. We've got 3 continents at least. Tina Laughlin says shalom from North Carolina. Alan Hales loves the music. Stephanie Marie Diaz says shalom aleichem. Paula is with us from Chicago. Randy from Mayberry, North Carolina. Virginia Hawkins from Encinitas, California. Jimmy Burke from Columbus, Ohio. Tina Laughlin with us. Guy Thomas Kennedy from Dayton. Amy Washka from Jacksonville, Florida. Patrice Carter from St. George, Utah. Lots of folks. Wow. Harold Black from Portland, Oregon. Melaine Hazlett from Oklahoma. Rabbi Barbara Rubin says hello. I'm just not going to be able to get to all the hellos, but I'm so glad that you're all here. And over on the YouTube side, Mirasia Janut and Lynn from Texas. All right, this is a busy daf. Where are we? This is page 21, daf Chaf Aleph of Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 2, approaching the end of our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 2, though we won't get there tonight. Once again, we're going to start our discussion with a well in the public domain and what we do to adjust it and whom it serves in this case. And pretty soon, we're going to go on some wild digressions. All right, so the concept that we've been talking about, this well in the public domain, and that since we can't draw water from the well itself is a private domain. If we take water out of it and we're standing in the public domain, so then we would have made and we do that on Shabbos, we would have made a Shabbos transgression by taking something from a private domain to a public domain. So the sages instituted this leniency that for a well, we could make a pretty simple adjustment of using some upright boards and make some corner posts out of them. And that's going to become a virtual enclosure that's going to make this whole area around the private domain that's in the well like an extended private domain so that we can take water out of the well and then make use of the water. And now the question we answer today is, for whom was that decree instituted? Who is this for? For what purpose did the sages institute this leniency? So Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Ada says that the upright boards, let me just make an adjustment here, the upright boards around the wells were instituted for the festival pilgrims. Who are the festival pilgrims? So this is in the land of Israel, when we had the ancient kingdom of Israel, and it was a Torah obligation that 3 times a year, people should go up to Jerusalem. They should bring offerings with them. And that's not easy, right? If all the population of Israel, and not everybody goes every time, not everybody can, but a lot of people go whenever possible. And so you have this flow of people, large numbers of people up to Jerusalem. And so these people, I mean, they got to drink water on the way to Jerusalem. It's not like they had roadside gas stations like we do now, and it's not like they get there in a few hours. Israel today, you can drive from top to bottom in not so many hours. But if you're walking, this can be a serious journey when you're walking from the north of Israel all the way to Jerusalem. So it seems that, according to Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Ada, see, the upright boards were instituted for the festival pilgrims. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, for the pilgrims? Wasn't it instituted for the cattle? It's actually for animals, so that the animals can drink. So the Gemara answers its own question and says, which cattle? The cattle of the pilgrims. Now, why are the pilgrims bringing their cattle with them when they're making a festival pilgrimage to Jerusalem? Presumably, at least some of them are bringing animals, not just cows, maybe sheep as well. They're bringing them as offerings, right? So when you make a festival pilgrimage, this is your opportunity. The people couldn't make sacrifices anywhere but Jerusalem. So when they go to Jerusalem, this is when they're going to take advantage and have that opportunity to make their sacrifices at the Holy Temple. And there's various kinds of sacrifices. Maybe they're bringing a peace offering. Maybe they're bringing a thanksgiving offering. Maybe it's a sin offering. Maybe it's a guilt offering. Maybe it's an elevation offering. There's different offerings. Not everybody brings animals up to there. Some people who can't afford it will bring birds or even meal offerings. Tonight's class is not about sacrifices in the temple. The point is that people with their animals are flowing up to Jerusalem. And it seems, according to this teaching, that this leniency about being able to draw water out of wells in the public domain was really for the purpose of these pilgrims. Okay, but then hold on, let me just read this. And then it's for this reason. Okay, so then we get this further teaching. Okay, so if it's for the animals, if it really, this leniency about the wells on the way up to Jerusalem is so that the animals can drink, then why do we also have a requirement that's taught elsewhere that the water in these wells has to be fit for human consumption? Right? There's water that's fit for animal consumption that is not fit for human consumption, but these wells are supposed to have water in them that is fit for human consumption. What's the purpose of that if we can only draw water on Shabbos, right, in terms of these partitions, these corner posts around the wells, so that we can draw on Shabbos? What difference does it make if we can only draw for the animals? Why does it have to be fit for human consumption? And the answer is yes, it's supposed to be for the animals. Why? Because the humans have the possibility of leaning over into the well. And in some cases, when they're larger wells, they can even climb down into the well so that they're literally in the well. There's like a step there. They don't necessarily have to have their feet in the water, but they're in the well itself, in the cistern, and then they can just drink water for themselves. In terms of drawing water, that's going to be for the animals, because the animals cannot climb down into the well, and nor do we want the animals sticking their mouth directly into the water of the well, because the humans are going to be drinking that water, right? So that's why it needs to be fit for human consumption. Okay, but what if the humans can't climb in, right? Maybe it's an older person who can't get over that wall and go down. Or maybe some of the wells were very wide and it was really possible for a person to climb down. So if it wasn't possible for the person to get right into the well or right over the well, then yes, they could draw water for themselves as well as for their animals on Shabbos. Okay. Now that we're talking about these wells and for the pilgrims, and their purpose for the pilgrims, we get this teaching that's going to become a hinge for the digression. So Rav Yimeya bar Abba says, in the name of Rav, that huts and boards don't apply in Babylonia. All right, so let's unpack that. In terms of the boards, so that's what we're talking about, these wells, right? So Rav is saying that making this virtual enclosure around a well, it works in the land of Israel because there's festival pilgrims, right? There's people going up to Jerusalem, and that's why this leniency was instituted. But for the Jewish community in Babylonia, and by extension, Jewish communities elsewhere in the diaspora, okay, so they're not pilgrims going up to Jerusalem, so they don't get the benefit of this leniency, according to Rav Yimeya bar Abba, in the name of Rav. The other leniency, the other rule that doesn't apply in Babylonia, according to Rav Yimeya, is the law of huts. Now, what he's talking about is that on Shabbos, we can walk anywhere within our city. We're just talking, now we're not talking about carrying, we're just talking about how far you can walk on Shabbos. So within your city, it doesn't matter how large the city is, you can walk anywhere in the city. But once you get to the edge of the city, now you've reached the limit, and beyond that, you can only go, depending on which sugya you're learning in the Talmud, there's different measurements, but the most standard one is that you can only walk 2,000 cubits beyond the edge of the city. However, where is the edge of the city? So that's not always clear. If it's a walled city, okay, it's pretty clear the edge of the city is where the wall is, but not necessarily. Even if there's a wall there, what if there's houses outside the wall, or if there's no wall, just outside what is considered the border, the boundary of the city, but there's houses right up against that boundary. So now we learn that, okay, well, actually the city extends as far as those houses. It doesn't say it here on this stuff, but I heard from Sruli Bornstein today, when I was listening to him teach this daf, that there's this measure of 70, I believe, and 2/3 cubits. So if that house is within 70 and 2/3 cubits, and I'm not sure where he gets that measurement, but that's the measurement, within 70 plus cubits of the city, so then the edge of the city is where that house is. And then if there's another house within 70 cubits of that, so then we keep extending the edge of the city, and that can go on for quite a while. Okay, so but now Rav Yimeya is saying that rule of extending the edge of the city for the purposes of walking on the distance that you can walk on Shabbos, he says it doesn't apply in Babylonia, that only applies in Israel. But then the Gemara comes in and says, listen, Rav Yimeya said this in the name of Rav, but we don't hold that way. So actually, these two laws do apply in Babylonia. There is a law of huts. There is a law of houses outside the city that will extend the border of the city. And there is the law of wells, that we can make these virtual enclosure around wells, and then you can draw water from them on Shabbos. So 2 questions. First, why, if there's no festival pilgrims outside of Israel, why is this law going to apply in Babylonia? Not only that, I mean, the temple had been destroyed for a long time when these sages were talking about this law in Babylonia. So what is justifying making this leniency about enclosures around wells in Babylonia, perhaps as much as 500 years after the second temple is destroyed? Answer, yeshivas, right? Schools of Torah learning, academies of Torah learning. So there's a big Jewish community in Babylonia. It exists in a bunch of different towns. And it's very possible that a person is on the road and he's going to go learn Torah in another city. So since he's on the road for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah of Torah learning, so we're going to extend that leniency for him. It doesn't answer, well, what if a person is not on the road for Torah learning? Can he still make use of that enclosure? And it seems that since some people use it for that purpose, it's enough that we can extend this law to the Jewish community in Babylonia. With regard to the huts, okay, so we extend the boundary for the purpose of walking on Shabbos using houses that are spaced, within 70 cubits of each other and within 70 cubits of the edge of the city. But there's going to be a limit on that, a qualification. And that is, if this is in an area where there are either a lot of storms and floods or thieves, which leads to the conclusion that these huts that you see outside the city, which are, they're not really dwellings, right? They have to be dwellings. If they're dwellings, it works. But if they're the huts of watchmen who use them just to, sort of watch over the fields, the crops of wealthy landowners, but people don't actually live in them, well, it would still work if it wasn't in a region where there's often floods or thieves. But if there are floods and thieves, then there's a limit to how much watchmen are going to live in those huts because it's dangerous. Because the huts might get washed away in a storm, or because thieves might come and take advantage and rob them or kill them. And so it's dangerous. And so we can't count on these things being inhabited. But as long as they're actually inhabited dwellings, then we can make use of this rule of extending the border of the city. And then there was a story that Rav Hisda said to Marei, the son of Rav Huna. He said, I heard that you walked from your city, which was Barnisa. What was the name of that city? Hold on, let me look that up. I heard, hold on a second. Yes, that you walked from Barnish to Daniel's synagogue. So Daniel is Daniel, the prophet who has the book of Daniel in the Bible. All right, so Daniel, the events of Daniel, that happened to him in Babylonia, right? So that's why he has a synagogue in Babylonia where he would pray. So there's tradition that this place, where this building, this site where Daniel the prophet would pray, it's still there, and we know where it is. And so Rav Hisda, I lost my name. So Rav Hisda said to Marei, the son of Rav Huna, so I heard you walk from Barnish to Daniel's synagogue. But that's 3 parsangs, translate about 8 miles. So that's way too far for you to walk on Shabbos. Maybe you think you can make use of this law of huts, but don't you hold like your father's father, who said in the name of Rav that huts don't apply in Bava? Now, we just heard from the Gemara that we don't hold like Rav, and that the huts do apply, but not, right? Not when there's floods and thieves, etc. So perhaps the huts in this area, it wouldn't work because of those floods and thieves, etc. So Marei, the son of Rav Huna, answers Rav Hisda, well, next Shabbos I'm actually going to take that walk. Why don't you come with me and I'll show you how it is that I'm able to make that walk and not transgress the laws of Shabbos. So Rav Hisda went with Marei, and he saw that he wasn't relying on these huts, but rather on ruins. So there were the ruins of houses, and there's a definition within the law, a legal definition of how much of the ruin still has to be standing. Can't remember right now, but I think it's a couple of walls, maybe a little bit of a floor, roof. There's a definition of how much of these old houses that are actual dwellings still needs to be standing in order to count as dwellings and they have to be within those 70 cubits of the city and of each other. And there was just a string of these ruins of dwellings. There were enough of them so that he could walk those 8 miles and technically still be within the city. Now, we've had this question before, and I guess it's worth mentioning again. Sometimes people say, well, when we say these legal loopholes, isn't it violating the spirit of Shabbos? No, it's just the opposite, right? Because remember that in terms of what the Torah says, what the Bible says about Shabbos is you shall not work, and you shall rest, and you shall delight in Shabbos. It doesn't have like that many specific requirements of Shabbos. It says you shall remember Shabbos and you shall guard Shabbos to keep it holy, but it doesn't say what the rules are. So it was the sages themselves who created these rules, like for example, how far you can walk on Shabbos. And so since it was the sages themselves that said, okay, well, this is in order to guard Shabbos, keep Shabbos, make it a delight, make it holy, there's going to be a limit of how far we can walk. They're going to find a scriptural source for where they get those measurements. But then it was the sages themselves who said, well, let's make sure these laws aren't too onerous. And so since we made the laws, let's understand exactly what's going on in those laws so that we can enjoy Shabbos, which ultimately is the purpose of this, right? So finding a way to work within the letter of the law and still make, this kind of pseudo pilgrimage to the synagogue of Daniel in Babylonia. It's the perfect, that is the process that we want to see rabbis engaging in to both make a fence around the Torah so we don't come to make transgressions, and to, in a sense, open up the Torah so that we can enjoy our Shabbos within those Torah boundaries. Let's move on. Rav Hisda said, okay, now we're going to get some really interesting teachings. And so now that we're talking, right, we're not talking about eruv anymore. We're not talking about boards and wells. Now we're starting to take some of these digressions. We've already mentioned Rav Hisda, and so now we get another teaching of Rav Hisda. So Rav Hisda said that Marei bar Mar, another sage, interpreted homiletically what is the meaning of that which is written. So he's going to take a verse from Psalms, from Psalm 119, that's the really long psalm, Psalm 119, verse 96, right? Psalm 119 is the longest psalm by a lot. 117, I think, is like 2 verses or 1 verse. 119 is immense. So he's going to bring down this teaching about this verse. And the verse is, I have seen a limit to every purpose, but your commandment is exceedingly broad. So now and today, since we're talking about what is the nature of the decrees of the sages, what is the nature of the oral Torah, and how it relates to the written Torah, so the sages are going to talk about exactly that relationship in today's daf. So he's going to start by saying, we have this verse in Psalms, I have seen a limit to every purpose, but your commandment is exceedingly broad. This idea with regard to the breadth of Torah was stated by King David, but he did not explain it. So what he's going to get at now is, okay, we know what the written Torah is, right? The 5 books of Moses, that's the written Torah. But the oral Torah, which was given to Moses at the same time as the written Torah, right? The oral Torah that was given to Moses contained a bunch of teachings, oral teachings, which were directly transmitted to Moses. And those are traditions that Moses handed down to Joshua and to the elders and to the prophets and eventually to the sages. But in every generation, the oral Torah grows. Now, does it grow because the sages, the leaders in each generation are making stuff up? No. It grows because they're discovering what's already there. The Torah is vast. The written Torah is sort of like the tip of the iceberg. But the whole Torah is much, 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 much bigger. How much bigger? And that's what he's going to, Rav Hisda in the name of Marei bar Mar is talking about right now. Well, how big is the Torah? How big is the actual Torah? So King David said, I've seen a limit to every purpose, but your commandment is exceedingly broad. Your commandment meaning your teaching, your general teaching, Torah with a capital T, God's Torah. It's vast. How vast is it? David said it was vast, but he didn't say how vast. It was stated by Job, but he did not explain it either. And it was stated by Ezekiel, but he also did not explain it until the prophet Zechariah, the son of Iddo, came and explained it. So then he brings down a few verses, one by Job, one by Ezekiel, to show that they also said the Torah is vast, but they didn't say how vast. So Job said, its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Okay, it's bigger than the earth and the sea, but how much bigger? And Ezekiel said, and he spread it, the scroll, before me, and it was written inside and outside, and in it was written lamentations and melody. And so the Gemara will explain that there was the inside and the outside, and perhaps this refers to the written Torah and the oral Torah, and lamentation and melody, and maybe this refers to teachings in this world, and melody refers to teachings in the world to come, perhaps, but it's not clear. But he still didn't say how big, right? How big is that scroll? So Ezekiel did not explain the extent of the Torah until Zechariah, the son of Berechia, the son of Iddo, came and explained it, as it is written. This is Zechariah talking. And he said to me, right? God said to me, what do you see? And I said, I see a flying scroll, and the length of it is 20 cubits, and the breadth of it is 10 cubits. Okay, so it's a scroll that's 20 cubits long and 10 cubits high. That doesn't sound so vast, except we're not talking about human cubits. We're talking about God's cubits. How big are God's cubits? Since the scroll was flying, the implication is that it had 2 equal sides, so that when you open it, it is 20 by 20 cubits. And it was written inside and outside, i.e. on both sides. And when you peel them apart and separate the 2 sides, how much is it? Well, its entire area amounts to 40 by 20 cubits, or 800 of God's cubits. Okay, it's 800 cubits of area, 800 square cubits, but of God's cubits. In order to determine the measure of God's cubit, the Gemara cites a verse that describes the size of the span between God's thumb and little finger in a manner of speaking. We know that God has no form, no shape. These are all metaphorical verses. It says that we're created in the image of God. What does that mean? It means that God, in some sense, right, has some manifestation of God, not God himself, but at some point God has some kind of manifestation for us to see, which has some kind of a relationship to the human form. And it is written, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure. Right? So Isaiah was just, this is a verse from Isaiah, who was just saying it's immeasurable. We can't understand how big God is. We can't. It is impossible. We do not understand the infinity of God at all. But to try to help us understand just how beyond our understanding it is, Isaiah brings in a few concepts. And Isaiah, is one of the holiest, highest prophets ever. Incredible vision. It's Isaiah's vision that we chant in synagogue when we say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, because he was given a vision of the heavenly choir singing before the Lord. So he saw beyond this world a little bit. He sees much more than we ever saw because of his vision of heaven. And from that measure, we can sort of figure out, we find, according to this calculation, if the entire world measures 1 square span, the whole universe, right? The whole universe is 1 square span, which is 1/4 of 1 square cubit. So we find, according to this calculation, that the entire world is 1 part in 3,200 of the Torah. So what the sages are saying here is that the whole known universe, right? And you could take it the way we understand it today. Big Bang cosmology, the ever-expanding universe, billions and billions of light years across, billions of galaxies, the whole shebang, all of that universe is like 1/3200th of the Torah, right? The Torah, the teachings of the Torah, the wisdom of the Torah is 3,200 times bigger than the entire universe. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the wisdom of the Torah. And it's no wonder that in every generation we can discover a little bit more of that vastness and add it to what's known to us, and that is compiled in the oral Torah. And that's why the Talmud now is 73 volumes if you're looking at the Art Scroll Torah, right? The wisdom of the humanity, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, is 23 volumes, and the wisdom of the Jews is 73 volumes. Why? Because it's just what we've managed to discover of God's Torah, which we'll never be able to fully plumb. Maybe we'll get a better sense of it when we leave this world and we arrive in the world to come. All right, that's from today's daf. Next, we have a teaching of Rava. Rava interpreted a verse homiletically. All right, let's get to Rava. So Rava is going to interpret a different verse. We're still talking about the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah. So he interpreted this verse homiletically as follows. What is the meaning of that which is written? This is a verse from Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 14. The mandrakes, the dudaim, the mandrakes. So these are the same mandrakes that when Leah wanted to, she felt spurned by Jacob, and then she asked for the mandrakes. I can't remember the story right now. I just didn't look it up before teaching today. But it's that story. Didn't Eruvin pick the mandrakes, and then Rachel asked for them, and so Eruvin gave the mandrakes to Rachel, and that gave Leah access to her husband, because Leah had more children by Jacob, but Jacob really, his love was for Rachel. It was a sad situation for the sisters who loved each other and supported each other, but both knew that they were married to a man who greatly preferred Rachel to Leah. So there was this incident that involved the mandrakes. It's the same fruit. So the mandrakes yield a fragrance, and at our doors are all manner of choice fruits, new and old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved. Now, we should know that the Song of Songs, the Shir HaShirim, the book is a book in the Bible, which the sages actually debated quite a bit about whether it should be included in the Bible or not. Because on its face, it seems to be an erotic love song about romantic love between man and woman. But of course, there's a deeper level, and really what the Shir HaShirim is, what Song of Songs is about, is the kind of ideal love we would feel for God, right? If we could become spiritual enough that we could feel that same kind of longing in our hearts that we experience, when we have romantic love, when we have a romantic yearning for another person in this world, it's not so easy to have that kind of yearning for God, because God is silent and invisible. And it takes, sort of growth, spiritual growth, in order to have that kind of a longing for God. But that's the goal, okay? So it's a verse from Song of Songs. And Rav is going to interpret this verse, okay? Now, the line, new and old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved, the congregation of Israel said before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, I have decreed many decrees upon myself through the enactments and ordinances of the sages, more than what you decreed upon me in the Torah, and I have fulfilled them. These are the new laws which were added to the old ones stated in the Torah, right? So here, homiletically speaking, sort of, lyrically speaking, it's like the children of Israel are saying, according to Rava, to God, look how much we love you, right? You gave us 613 commandments in the Torah. Our sages have decreed on us thousands more, just so that we don't come to transgress those 613, and we have willingly accepted, right? Whoever did that, it's unbelievable, right? You think, okay, the 10 commandments, all right, well, I can live by the 10 commandments. But 613 commandments, and on top of that, thousands more. What are we doing to ourselves? Why should we do such a thing? And it's because God said to do it. And we want to make sure that we do what God said and that we don't come to transgress what God said. So we're going to take on these extra stringencies just to protect us from coming to violate God's will in any way. See, God, how much we love you, right? That's the idea of that. Okay, and Rav Hisda said to one of the sages who would arrange the traditions of the Agadah before him, the story parts of the oral tradition, did you hear what the meaning of new and old is? And the sage said to him, these new are the more lenient mitzvahs, and these, the old, are the more stringent mitzvahs. And Rav Hisda said to him, no, that can't be. For was the Torah given on two separate occasions, that there were lenient ones and stringent ones given separately? No, of course not. Rather, these, the old mitzvahs from the Torah, and these, the new ones, are from the sages, right? So new and old are these laws that bind us to the Holy One. Right? And it's not that it's a bummer and it's a pain and it's annoying and, why do I have to do this and so many obligations? Like once you get into, being a Jew and living as a Jew or a person of faith, right? It doesn't even have to be within Judaism because this is available to everybody by virtue of the Noahide laws. And again, there's only 7 Noahide laws, but they're categories of laws. And in order to be able to fulfill those 7 laws, you really do have to understand a lot of what the sages were talking about with their decrees. And in order to understand what the decrees even are and whether they apply to you or not, you got to get involved in Torah study, which is, one of the highest of all the commandments. Okay. And so now that we're talking about, so the decrees of the sages are as dear to God as the commandments that he gave us, right? So that's what's being taught here, that you need to understand and fulfill both. The laws that are in the Torah and the decrees of the sages that enable us to fulfill the laws in the Torah. Okay, lest you say, if the words of the sages are of substance and have such great importance, well, why weren't they written in the Torah in the first place? The verse states, of making many books, there is no end. That's a line from Ecclesiastes, meaning that it is impossible to fully commit the oral Torah to writing as it is boundless. It was always intended to be this way. It was always intended that there's this boundless Torah like we've been talking about that's 3,200 times bigger than the entire universe. The written part is just like the door that opens the way to that vast Torah. And it's, a lifetime of study and hundreds of generations of study that enables us to even grasp some small part of that greater Torah that the sages are bringing to us. So to help us understand how important all these teachings are, now we hear a story about Rabbi Akiva as he was imprisoned near the end of his life. It doesn't say so here. I never heard this before, but Shuli Bornstein in his shir today, I heard that Rabbi Akiva was imprisoned during this time, right now, during Elul. So Rosh Chodesh Elul, from Rosh Chodesh Elul, he was imprisoned, and then eventually he was martyred. He was burnt at the stake by the Romans on Yom Kippur. Okay, but during the period of his imprisonment, he was already a very old man. He had lived an incredible life. First, he'd had 24,000 disciples. Tragically, they all died of a plague. But then he had 5 key students. We've mentioned them before. Rabbi Meir was one of them. And it was through those 5 that really this vast oral tradition was not lost from Israel. Rabbi Akiva is really one of, top sages in Jewish history. Let's say top 3, where Moses is one of them. But Rabbi Akiva ended up having a terrible, terrible, terrible end where they soaked him so that he would last a little longer and have more pain, and then they burned him. Terrible, terrible, terrible death. But before his death, he was in prison. Why was he in prison, and why was he sentenced to die by the Romans? For teaching Torah after they had banned the teaching of Torah. Why did they come down so hard on Torah? Because of the Bar Kokhba rebellion against Rome in approximately the year 135 of the Common Era. After that, terrible, terrible, terrible rebellion, terrible result. 1 million Jews were murdered because of it. The land was salted and destroyed. It was awful. The whole incident was absolutely terrible. And then they said, no more Torah. That's it. No one can teach Torah. No one can learn Torah. We want to get rid of this whole Jewish Torah thing. But Rabbi Akiva kept teaching. And there's that famous story where they said to him, how could you keep teaching Torah when it's going to lead to you being killed? And he said, the parable of the fishes and the fox, right? Because the fishes were all running around in the stream because there was a predatory fish in there, like a barracuda was eating the smaller fishes. So the fox, who was on the shore, said to the fishes that were running from the barracuda, hey, why don't you come up here on land with me where the barracuda can't come and you'll be safe? And the fishes said, silly fox, if here in the water, which is our natural element, we are in danger, how much worse would it be out there on land where we would be deprived of the water that sustains our lives? And Torah is often, throughout the Talmud, likened to water. So Rabbi Akiva was saying it's dangerous for us now to teach Torah. But if we cease teaching Torah, that will be much worse, because then we'll stop being Jews. The Jews will be wiped out. We can't stop learning Torah just because they're threatening us. So he was arrested, he was imprisoned, and they were treating him terribly in prison. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, it once happened that Rabbi Akiva was incarcerated in a prison, and Rabbi Yehoshua Hagarsi would come to the prison to attend to his needs. So Rabbi Yehoshua Hagarsi was like the gabbai of the rabbi. He was the assistant to the rabbi, and he was the one who kept bringing him food and water every day. Prisons back then, it's not like the state fed you while you were in prison. As if your friends didn't bring you food, you starved to death in prison. So would attend to his needs. And every day his disciples would bring him water in a measured quantity. One day the prison guard met Rabbi Yehoshua Hagarsi and said to him, the amount of water today is more than usual. Perhaps you're bringing water in order to soften the walls of the prison so that you can, tunnel through them and break out your teacher, Rabbi Akiva. So I'm not going to let you take that much water into the prison. And he poured out half of the water. And then allowed him to take the rest to Rabbi Akiva. So when Rabbi Yehoshua came to Rabbi Akiva saw the small amount of water that he had brought. Akiva said, Yehoshua, do you not know that I am old and my life depends on your life? No one else brings me water. So if you bring me less than I need, my life is endangered. And Rabbi Yehoshua related to him what happened and how the prison guard made him pour it out. Rabbi Akiva understood. He said, all right, well, give me water so that I may wash my hands. Yehoshua said to him, what are you talking about? The water that I brought you is not even sufficient for your drinking needs. Why are you going to wash your hands? And Akiva said, well, I want to eat a little bit of food, and I can't eat the food if I don't wash my hands first, because the sages instituted that I wash my hands. Now, we have a teaching that the laws of the Torah are the laws that we live by. We live by the Torah. We don't die by the Torah. So it was wrong for Akiva to endanger himself if he's going to be so stringent that in order, to be able to eat some food, he's going to do, this ritual washing before he eats. We've already seen that soldiers in the field in a military camp don't have to wash their hands because it's dangerous for them, and they're hungry and they need to just be able to eat. So why did Rabbi Akiva have to endanger his life when he had so little water to drink that he was actually going to use it to wash his hands in this precarious situation? One explanation is that's okay for the average Jew, but when you're talking about a sage of Akiva's stature, to him the law of the rebellious elder attaches, right? So if a great sage rejects the teachings of his colleagues, that's known as the rebellious elder, and he could actually be sentenced to death, even though a regular person would not be sentenced to death in that situation. An alternative explanation is that at this point, Rabbi Akiva, he was coming to the end of his life anyway, and he was actually looking forward, and as we'll read at another incident when we get to it in the Talmud, that when he actually was martyred, his students asked to him, what are you experiencing? And he actually was able to end his life saying the Shema and completing Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And he died on the word one. But before he got there, he said to his students who were watching this awful execution, All my life I wondered if I would be able to love the Lord my God with all my heart and with all my soul. And what does with all my soul mean? Even if he takes my soul. And I never knew if I would be able to fulfill that mitzvah. I have fulfilled all the other mitzvahs that I could in my life. That's the one that's missing to me, and now I'm going to be able to do it with my death. And that will be a teaching that will be remembered, and it's worth it to me. So that's another explanation of why Akiva allowed himself to end up in a situation where he was martyred, because normally we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to endanger ourselves. As we saw in the law of the military camp, they don't have to wash their hands before eating. They do have to wash their fingers after eating. Why? To protect them from hurting themselves, because they might have sodomite salt mixed in with the regular salt in their food, and then they rub their eyes and hurt themselves. Life above all things. We're not supposed to martyr ourselves, right? I mean, if they say bow down to an idol or we'll kill you, okay, that's a situation. Some say you're obligated to martyr yourself. Others say you're permitted to martyr yourself. But generally speaking, if there's any way out of that situation, you take it. You don't let your life be endangered. We see that teaching over and over and over and over and over. You don't endanger yourself. But Akiva, he was on another plane. And so what applied to him is not for us. But that was his end. And he used that water to wash his hands so that he could fulfill a decree of the sages. And this is to teach us how important the decrees of the sages are. Finally, I know this is a long class. I got just two short little teachings. So this idea of creating an eruv so that we can carry on Shabbos, and washing the hands, that we should wash our hands before a meal. So both of those are not in the Torah. When were they instituted? When did that come in? Which sage instituted that? It's actually long before the rabbis. It was instituted by King Solomon. Why? Why not before King Solomon? Why didn't Joshua institute those decrees? Why not some of the prophets before King Solomon? Why was it King Solomon? Because until the kingdom of Solomon, until the reign of King Solomon, it was basically endless wars. From the time that Joshua led the Jews into the Holy Land, there were wars, and there were wars off and on with the Philistines and the Amalekites and the Moabites and the Assyrians, and I'm not even listing correctly, but there were just a lot of wars, and there wasn't a peacetime. And as we saw, both those rules in the military camp, you neither have to make an eruv or wash your hands before eating. But finally, there was peace in the land, and then Solomon, who was the wisest man who ever lived, was able to look at the laws and say, you know what, we actually need this. We understand what carrying is, but we have to have a mechanism so that we can carry certain things on Shabbos so that we can delight in Shabbos. And as for washing our hands before eating, that's important because it shows our appreciation, right? We're going to say a blessing after we eat. We know that it says in the Torah. But to say the blessings before and to wash our hands before we eat, to really get that spiritual frame of mind before we eat, Solomon instituted those teachings. And when he instituted them, a bas kol, a divine voice, emerged and said in his praise, in King Solomon's praise, as it says in Proverbs, "My son, if your heart is wise, my heart will be glad, even mine. And again, my son, be wise and make my heart glad, that I may respond to he who taunts me." In other words, God was happy. God was pleased with these decrees that Solomon added to the laws in order to help us obey the Torah and fulfill the requirements of the Torah. And lastly, since we've been talking about teachings of Rava and how he interpreted verses from the Bible, what is the meaning of that which is written? "Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine has flowered, if the grape blossoms have opened, if the pomegranates are in flower. There will I give you my loves." Obviously from Song of Songs. How do we interpret this verse, these two verses from Song of Songs, chapter 7, verses 12 and 13? And Rava teaches, let us get up early to the vineyards. These are the synagogues and the houses of study. Let us see if the vine has flowered. These are the masters of the Bible, who are proficient in the first stage of Torah study. In other words, they have become proficient in Scripture. It means they've memorized the entire Bible, and they really know what every verse means, and how it's tied to other verses in the Bible. If the grape blossoms have opened, these are the masters of the Mishna. So the Mishna is that essential collection of the oral Torah, the first one that was compiled by Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, in about the year 200. But he compiled it, but these teachings had been there all along. But it's that first, sort of compilation of those oral teachings that people had been studying for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the verse, if the pomegranates are in flower, these are the masters of the Gemara, the Talmud. And there will I give you my loves, means I will show you my glory and my greatness, the praise of my sons and daughters, and how they adhere to sanctity. And so this was the traditional path for an educated Jew to grow in Jewish wisdom. First, he would learn the Bible. And back then, that meant memorize the Bible. And then he would study the Mishnah, and then he would study the Gemara, right? So essentially getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the oral tradition. But as we've seen, really just kind of opening a window into a vast Torah that we could never understand or comprehend all of it, just getting some kind of a glimpse of what that vast Torah really is. That's what I've got for us today. Let me check some questions or comments. Our takeaway, is just, this was a really poetic and beautiful daf, a really beautiful page to try to give us a little bit of a feeling for how grand are the mansions of Torah in that greater spiritual realm. It's much greater and larger even than what we think is the vast physical universe. It's much bigger than even that. Okay. Rebecca Dreyer says, where would people stay once in Jerusalem during the pilgrimages? That's a really good question. I think, first of all, there must have been a system in place since there were so many people flowing to Jerusalem for Passover, for Shavuos, and for Sukkot, right? In the spring, in the fall, and in the summer. Where would they stay? I mean, I don't really know, but I bet, there was a system. A lot of them had friends in the city. There were certainly inns and hostels and hotels. Probably a lot of people were camping. Probably a lot of people were just sleeping in the streets. Part of the tithing process was, the first tithe would go to the priest, to the Cohen, and the next tithe would go to the Levites. And then there was the second tithe, which in 4 out of the 7 years of the cycle, you would bind up in your hand, and it was like the money that you would use to get you to Jerusalem and to eat while you're in Jerusalem and to enjoy yourself while you're in Jerusalem. So it was like, people had the money because they had to separate a tithe from the produce in their farms just so that they had the funds to go up to Jerusalem. So I'm not sure exactly where they would stay, but I would imagine there was a lot of different choices. And, wealthy people stayed in nice hotels and poor people maybe slept out in the street. But it was like the whole city was a party during those pilgrimages, during those festivals. And so there was just a lot going on. Lynn says, it was mentioned in this daf that not all biblical prohibitions could result in a death penalty, but all rabbinic decrees are subject to death at the hands of the heavenly court. How so? So I'm glad you brought that up. What they're saying is, and this is why we brought up this idea of the law of the rebellious elder, Rav Steinsaltz brings that down. So what they're saying is, don't think that because there's the written laws, that those are more important than the laws which are passed down and discovered by our sages through the generation to generation oral tradition. Don't think that those are any less important. In some senses, they're more important because that's part of the unflowering, the flowering of Torah over the generations. So don't despise the oral teachings. And a person who despises the oral teachings means turns his back on the oral Torah. And that's what the Sadducees were, right? The Pharisees were the followers of rabbinic Judaism and the oral tradition. And the Sadducees were saying, well, we know better. There's a written Torah. We only believe in the written Torah. That's it. And so they were totally missing the point, and they were missing the vastness and the grandeur and the beauty of Judaism, and they were cutting themselves off. They were cutting themselves off from the source of life. So it's not so much that, heaven is going to go like, oh, you're a bad person because you turn your back on the oral Torah. It's more like those people, it's a natural consequence that when you cut yourself off from the wisdom of this tradition, it's like a spiritual death, and it's going to cut you way short in your spiritual growth, both in this life and in the world to come when you leave this world. And finally, this is that reference to the mandrakes that I mentioned earlier. Thank you, Nina. So this was from Genesis 30, verses 14 through 16, that Leah's son Reuben finds mandrakes, a mandrake root which looks like a newborn baby, was often considered a fertility charm and an aphrodisiac. Rachel wants the mandrakes, and she has something that Leah wants even more than the mandrakes. She has occupancy of Jacob's bed, and so they make an exchange, right? Rachel is just not having a child. She's infertile. It seems that she's not going to ever have a baby, so maybe these mandrakes can help her conceive. What she has is Jacob's bed because he loves her so much. Leah is very fertile. She's already had a bunch of kids, but she's not. She feels, despised. That Jacob doesn't care. Not despised, but what's the word? That he just doesn't care about her. That she's just sort of left to her own devices. And so they make this trade that Leah, will get more access to Jacob, and Rachel maybe will get these mandrakes that will help her conceive and have a child. And eventually she has Joseph and eventually Benjamin. But in giving birth to Benjamin, tragically, Rachel dies and ends up being buried in Rachel's tomb, which is an incredibly spiritual visit if you ever go there when you make your pilgrimage to Israel. That is what I've got for us today. What a journey we just took. We started with wells, and then we went out to the vast, vast, vast universe of Torah, which is 3,200 times bigger than the whole physical universe and all its billions of galaxies. May you be blessed to grow in wisdom every day. And we've got a few more of these very special teachings tomorrow before we work our way back into the laws of eruv. So hope to see you tomorrow at our regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. That'll be Monday night. Have a great Sunday